In the early weeks of the 1968 dry season, an American infantry company pushed steadily through the broken highlands of central Vietnam. The terrain, thick jungle canopy, shallow creeks, and sudden ridgelines turned every kilometer into a negotiation with the land itself. On paper, the mission was straightforward. Reach Hill 482 before local POV units established fortified positions that could threaten supply routes to the south. In reality, nothing in that sector was ever straightforward. Portable radios crackled with interference, distorted by the uneven terrain and persistent humidity. Intelligence reports arrived in fragments, often based on aerial observations rendered unreliable by dense cover. And above all, the company was racing the clock. If they arrived too late, they would face entrenched defenders, making withdrawal costly and any advance nearly impossible. Among the men moving through the muted undergrowth was Sergeant William Harlow, a veteran of earlier deployments. Unlike many of the younger soldiers, Harlow relied heavily on traditional methods, careful topographic map reading, terrain pattern recognition, and silent navigation using subtle environmental cues. To the newer troops, it seemed like an anachronism. In an age of expanding battlefield technology, depending on paper and a wax pencil felt outdated. But while others followed sporadic radio instructions, Harlow walked with measured attention, noting soil moisture, the direction of water runoff, and the alignment of ridges. In his mind, each step either confirmed their route or raised quiet doubts. The company believed they were on the correct approach. Yet in this part of Vietnam, even a minor deviation could mean losing orientation, or worse, walking directly into an ambush line. It was within this tense, uncertain advance that Harlow's old-school skills would begin to matter more than any piece of modern gear the platoons carried. If you're enjoying this historical breakdown, consider leaving a like. For most of the company, Sergeant Harlow's attachment to maps was little more than a running joke, something whispered during breaks in the march or traded in hushed tones while weapons were checked. The younger soldiers had grown up in an army increasingly reliant on radio relays, aerial reconnaissance, and the assumption that technology would bridge any gap left by experience. To them, the sergeant's habit of kneeling beside a tree root, unfolding a worn laminated grid sheet, and marking faint contour lines with a grease pencil felt strangely ceremonial, useful perhaps in another war, but out of place in the humid density of Vietnam. Small gestures betrayed their amusement. A private would raise his eyebrows at another when Harlow paused to examine the angle of a hillside. A corporal would mutter that they lacked time for old-school cartography. Even a junior lieutenant, still adapting to field command, occasionally dismissed Harlow's observations with well-meaning but hasty confidence. "The radio says the trail continues northwest. We stick to what we know." None of it carried malice. It was simply the quiet divide between generations, one shaped by theory and equipment, the other by fieldcraft and memory. Yet beneath the surface, tension simmered. The company had begun to experience slight discrepancies in their planned route. The main trail, supposedly marked by helicopter reconnaissance earlier that week, seemed to shift unpredictably, narrowing in some areas and disappearing entirely in others. The jungle here grew irregularly, and decades-old footpaths, eroded by rainfall and reclaimed by vegetation, often blended into the terrain so seamlessly that even trained scouts could lose them. Still, the radio operators insisted their bearings aligned with the company's location. Their confidence reassured the officers, who trusted the signal more than the muted warnings of a veteran sergeant leaning over a piece of paper. But Harlow sensed the drift early. He noticed how the gradient of the slope contradicted the contour spacing on the map, how the creek line they crossed was too shallow for that stretch of terrain, how tree formations indicated soil types inconsistent with their supposed position. He raised these points gently, methodically, never confrontational. Yet the replies were polite deflections, acknowledgement without action. As the march continued, the subtle signs multiplied. The jungle seemed to bend in directions that did not match the expected approach route. Bird calls grew sparse, replaced by pockets of unnatural quiet. Even the humidity shifted slightly, a difference too minor for most men to detect, but enough to signal a change in elevation that the company had not anticipated. Still, the unit pressed forward, guided primarily by the voice on the radio and the assumption that progress meant correctness. Late that afternoon, the first clear indication of trouble surfaced. A forward scout team returned with uneasy reports. The terrain ahead funneled into a narrow draw, hemmed in by steep rises on both sides, an ideal location for an ambush. According to the company's planned route, they should not have been anywhere near such a feature. But the lieutenant, confident in the radio's coordinates, attributed the discrepancy to mapping errors or vegetation changes since aerial photographs were taken. Harlow stood silent at first, studying the map with steady concentration. Then, in his measured voice, he pointed out the mismatch between their heading and the shape of the land around them. The private next to him smirked under his breath, and someone whispered, "Here he goes again." Even so, a few soldiers, especially those who had patrolled with him before, felt a faint unease at the casual dismissal of his warning. Underestimation reached its quiet peak in that moment. A veteran reading the landscape like a slow-moving narrative, surrounded by men who trusted static numbers more than the ground beneath their boots. The company's confidence in technology held firm, and the march continued into terrain none of them truly understood. Little did they know that the doubts Harlow carried, dismissed as outdated intuition, were the first signs that they were drifting toward danger, and that only his old-school methods would reveal the path that could still save them. The transition from doubt to realization began quietly, in the way such moments often do in the field. Without spectacle, just a series of small observations coalescing into something unmistakable. By mid-morning the next day, the company had advanced into terrain that felt subtly wrong, even to those who paid little attention to the map. The ground sloped in irregular angles. The tree line shifted in ways that suggested older growth to the west, younger regrowth to the east, and the faint trail they believed they were following began to fragment into competing animal paths. Still, the radio indicated they were within planned bounds. Confidence persisted. Sergeant Harlow, however, had begun tracing a different narrative, not on paper but in the terrain itself. Every misplaced creek, every unexpected rise in the soil was a sentence in a story he had been piecing together since the previous day. He moved along the column with a quiet intensity, comparing the angle of ridgelines to the contour shapes embedded in his memory. He paused often, not out of fatigue but analysis, placing his palm against the bark of trees to feel moisture levels, scanning the forest floor for disruptions that broke natural pattern. If you value detailed military history, subscribing ensures you won't miss the next installment. Around late morning, he noticed something that many soldiers would have dismissed: a slight depression cutting diagonally across a slope. It was narrow, drowned in undergrowth, nearly invisible unless someone looked at the ground rather than the horizon. But to a trained eye, it signaled age. Older than the war, older perhaps than the villages that once dotted these hills. An elephant path, long abandoned. The Vietnamese tribes of past decades had used elephants for transport in remote areas, and their trails often endured beneath layers of vegetation, detectable only by subtle breaks in root growth and the way rainwater distributed along them. Harlow crouched beside the depression, brushing aside leaves and compacted debris. The soil beneath was smoother than the surrounding ground, compacted long ago by repeated weight. He traced the line downslope with his eyes, following its gentle arc until it vanished into thickets of bamboo. It was not on his map, not the updated one carried by the officers, nor the older version he kept in his pack, but something about its angle aligned perfectly with the discrepancy he had been observing since the day before. When he rose, he scanned the western ridgeline again. The map's contour spacing suggested a more gradual incline, yet they were encountering sharper gradients. The conclusion, quiet, unspoken, but undeniable, was that the company had drifted east of their intended route. The Elephant Trail, if it extended far enough, might cut across the terrain and rejoin the correct axis from an unexpected angle. Or, more critically, it might bypass whatever danger lay ahead on the path the radio insisted they should follow. He approached the lieutenant carefully. Experience had taught him that presenting such findings required not urgency, but clarity. "Sir," he began, tapping the map with a pencil, "these contours don't match our actual elevation. We're drifting east. There's an old trail here, unmarked, that cuts across the slope. It may lead us around the draw ahead." The lieutenant exhaled, torn between responsibility and uncertainty. Behind him, a few soldiers exchanged doubtful looks, their expressions suggesting the familiar refrain. The sergeant and his maps again. Yet others, especially the seasoned ones, noticed the seriousness in Harlow's eyes. The lieutenant hesitated. "Radio says the main trail still runs northwest. Recon marked it 3 days ago." "With respect, sir," Harlow replied calmly, "the terrain says otherwise. The ground isn't lying. That draw the scouts found shouldn't be there." He pointed to the hidden depression. "Might be our correct axis." There was a pause. The sounds of the jungle, distant insects, wind shifting through bamboo, the drip of moisture from leaves, filled the silence as the officer weighed his options. He knew the consequences of choosing wrong, a wasted day if the sergeant was mistaken, or a potential ambush if the radio was. He finally gave a measured nod. "We take a small team. You show us what you're seeing." Harlow guided them 50 meters downslope, moving slowly, teaching as he walked. He pointed out how the vegetation thinned along a faint corridor, how the soil compacted where human eyes saw only chaos, how the slope's curvature matched no known animal patterns, except those shaped by heavy footfall over many years. The lieutenant, now observing more closely, could no longer deny the consistency in the details. Then came the moment that settled the question, a section where the undergrowth parted just enough to reveal the old path in unmistakable form, a shallow ribbon of earth with a gradient too uniform to be natural. It extended westward, almost parallel to where the map's planned route should have been. For the first time, the lieutenant whispered, almost to himself, "This shouldn't exist, but it fits." Harlow nodded, not triumphant, merely factual. "Sir, this trail cuts behind the ridgeline. If the enemy has eyes on the main approach, and they usually do, this will put us outside their expectation." When the reconnaissance team returned to the company with their findings, the air of skepticism began to shift. Those who once dismissed the sergeant's methods now watched him with a different expression. Not admiration yet, but the first signs of trust. The hidden trail, nearly erased by time, represented something rare in that part of Vietnam, an option the enemy might not anticipate. The lieutenant made his decision. The company would follow the old path, quietly, cautiously, and with Harlow navigating. For the first time since the operation began, the direction of the march was guided not by a sputtering radio signal, but by the terrain itself. None of them knew yet just how profoundly that choice would alter the battle ahead. The company's shift onto the hidden trail altered the character of the march almost immediately. Unlike the exposed route favored by radio guidance, the old elephant path wound through a series of shallow folds that acted as natural concealment. The dense jungle overhead formed a continuous canopy, filtering sunlight into muted greens and yellows. Visibility narrowed, but so did the likelihood of being observed. For the first time in 2 days, the men moved without the uneasy sense of being funneled toward danger. A brief note: your like helps preserve and share these historical accounts. Sergeant Harlow walked at the forefront of the lead platoon, not in a posture of authority, but quiet responsibility. Every few minutes he paused to verify the slope angle, confirm the orientation of tree lines, or check the subtle moisture patterns across the ground. To the soldiers behind him, the process appeared almost meditative. Slow, deliberate, but never uncertain. It was a rhythm formed not by technology, but by the land itself. 2 hours into the shift, the company reached a section where the trail bent westward, hugging the backside of a long ridge. According to the lieutenant's earlier plan, they should have been approaching the ridge's opposite side, a predictable avenue of approach, wide enough for platoon-level movement and historically favored by recon teams. Instead, they were now navigating a corridor no wider than a footpath, silent and obscured. The atmosphere along the column changed. Whispers replaced casual chatter. Even inexperienced soldiers sensed they were entering terrain the enemy would not expect to be traversed at scale. At midday, the reasoning behind Harlow's warnings became starkly clear. A scout team sent quietly to observe the main approach route, now several hundred meters east, returned with a grim report. From an elevated vantage, they spotted disturbed foliage, narrow trenches, and fresh signs of enemy activity. Worse, they detected metallic glints consistent with machine gun emplacements arranged to create overlapping fields of fire across the main trail. The enemy had prepared an ambush, well-positioned, patient, and lethal. Had the company followed the radio's guidance, they would have approached that funnel from the most exposed direction, precisely where the enemy intended. The realization spread rapidly through the ranks, carried not by panic but by a sober acknowledgement of how close they had come to disaster. The lieutenant called a brief halt to review the findings. When the scouts laid out the details, distances, angles, estimated numbers, the officers exchanged quiet looks, their earlier confidence in the radio shaken. Harlow listened without interruption. He did not gloat, nor did he highlight what his observations had prevented. His gaze remained on the terrain, studying the ridgeline, calculating silently how far the hidden trail might push them beyond the enemy's prepared perimeter. After a few minutes, the lieutenant approached him. "Sergeant, if we press farther along your trail, where does it put us?" Harlow unfolded his worn map, smoothing it across his thigh. "Here," he said, tapping an area west of the ridge. "This section is higher than the main approach, but the incline levels out before the crest. If the trail holds, we'll reach an unguarded saddle. From there, we can observe their positions from above." The officer nodded slowly. "And they wouldn't expect movement from that direction?" "No, sir. Not unless they mapped this trail decades ago." The decision came swiftly. The company would continue along the hidden corridor and attempt to flank the enemy positions. The shift demanded careful pacing. The trail narrowed further as it curved upslope, forcing single-file movement and heightened attention. But as they ascended, the ridge served as a natural sound baffle, masking their presence from any watchers below. An hour later, the company reached the saddle Harlow predicted. The vantage point was ideal, an elevated shelf with enough vegetation for concealment, but sparse enough to permit observation of the draw, where the enemy had prepared their ambush. Through binoculars, the lieutenant and platoon sergeants could see clear signs of a kill zone: interlocking machine gun nests, claymore-style directional charges, and narrow trenches angled to channel movement. The planned route had been a trap, meticulously constructed. From this elevated angle, however, the enemy positions revealed their vulnerabilities. The ridgeline itself, the one the company now occupied, was scarcely defended. The PAVN units had assumed the natural steepness of the western face would deter any approach. They never anticipated a seasoned NCO guiding a full company in from a forgotten trail. The lieutenant quickly organized a coordinated assault plan. One platoon would secure the ridgeline, another would descend partially to a flanking position, and the third would maintain overwatch from the saddle. Timing and silence were critical. Surprise was the only force multiplier they possessed. When the operation began, it unfolded with controlled precision. Soldiers advanced with slow, measured steps, using vegetation as cover. The enemy, fully focused on the anticipated approach from the east, had no indication of danger overhead. Harlow remained with the Overwatch platoon, assisting in establishing fields of observation and identifying weak points in the enemy's arrangement. If you want more stories told in this format, consider subscribing to the channel. The assault struck with sudden, overwhelming clarity. Fire descended from angles the PAVN defenders had not prepared for. Machine gun teams were neutralized before they could reorient. Trenches became exposed rather than protected. The carefully engineered ambush collapsed under pressure from above. Within minutes, the enemy broke contact, retreating northward in small, scattered groups. What could have been a catastrophic loss for the company transformed into a decisive tactical advantage. Only after the firing ceased did the full weight of what had happened settle on the men. The hidden trail had not merely provided a safer route, it had handed them the high ground, the element of surprise, and a clear path to dismantle a threat they never would have seen until it was too late. Several soldiers approached Harlow afterward, some quietly shaking his hand, others offering a simple nod. The earlier dismissive looks had vanished. What replaced them was not reverence, but a deeper, more grounded respect. The understanding that the sergeant's old-school map reading had not been nostalgia, it had been survival. As the company regrouped and prepared to continue toward Hill 482, the lieutenant turned to him and said, with sincere understatement, "Sergeant, you changed the entire course of this operation." Harlow only folded his map, slipped the grease pencil into his pocket, and replied, "Just reading the ground, sir. It tells the truth if you know how to listen." In the hours following the engagement, the company resumed its advance with a steadier confidence. The ridge now secured, the route to Hill 482 unfolded with fewer obstacles than anticipated. Though the operation continued to demand caution, the men moved with the awareness that they had survived a danger none of them had perceived. None except the sergeant who had read the land with practiced discipline. Word of the successful flank traveled quickly within the battalion. The lieutenant filed a concise, factual report, noting that a terrain-based navigation adjustment had enabled the company to bypass an ambush and seize advantageous ground. Official language understated the reality, but among the enlisted ranks, the credit was clearer. Soldiers who once dismissed Harlow's methods now watched him with a quiet trust, recognizing that the skills they once mocked had preserved their lives. Harlow himself remained unchanged. He carried no pride in the recognition, only a quiet affirmation that careful observation still held value in a war shaped increasingly by modern instruments. When younger soldiers approached him with questions about contour reading, terrain patterns, or how to identify old trails beneath thick jungle, he answered patiently, as if passing along lessons that belonged not to him, but to the craft itself. In the days ahead, the company's route planning subtly shifted. Officers incorporated Harlow's assessments into their decisions more readily. Patrol leaders cross-checked radio coordinates with terrain interpretation instead of relying on a single source. Incrementally, the unit grew more resilient, more aware that the land could clarify or contradict what technology claimed to know. The legacy of the hidden trail was not marked by medals or formal citations. It lived instead in the practical memory of the men who walked it. A quiet reminder that the battlefield rewards those who understand its shape, its history, and its subtle warnings. And for Sergeant William Harlow, it reaffirmed a truth he had carried through every deployment, that the map is only as useful as the eyes that read the world around it. With Hill 482 secured and the threat along the eastern draw dismantled, the operation advanced without the shadow of the unseen ambush. Yet the moment that had changed, everything remained deceptively small, a faint depression in the soil noticed by a man who still believed that the ground itself could speak. And in that belief, an entire company found its way home. Thank you for watching. A like or subscription truly helps keep this work going.